most nights on Kentucky Melody. We sit right here in the Bluegrass State. We tell stories from our mountains, our backroads, our cemeteries, our creeks, and our hollers. But every now and then, you run into a story so dark, so cold, so heavy, that Kentucky ain't even the right stage for it. Tonight, we're leaving home, because what you're about to hear might just be the darkest winter survival story ever recorded in American history. Not folklore, not rumor, not my cousin's friend saw something. This is documented. Diaries, witnesses, rescue testimonies, and the kind of details that stick in your mind like ice in your bones. It's a story where winter didn't just inconvenience people. Winter hunted them. It boxed them in. It starved them out. And little by little, it peeled away everything civilized until the only thing left was the raw truth. When the world turns white and the cold won't stop, a human being can change into something they don't even recognize. This is the story of the Donner Party. And if you listen all the way through, you may never look at a snowstorm the same way again. Welcome back to Kentucky Melody. I'm Earl, and if you love true history, Appalachian storytelling, and the kind of real-life horror that makes you appreciate a warm house and a full belly, you're in the right place. So grab you a blanket, turn the lights down low, and let's step back to 1846, to a wagon train, to a so-called shortcut, and to a mountain pass that turned into a frozen graveyard. In 1846, America was restless. People were moving west like ants after a storm. Back then, if you were poor or stuck or tired of scratching a living out of stubborn dirt, you heard one word like it was heaven speaking: California. California was the land of go out there and start over. Go out there and claim you a future. They said the soil was rich, the weather was soft, the work was plenty, and to a family sitting in Illinois with too many mouths to feed, that sounded like a miracle. So families sold what little they had, loaded wagons till the boards creaked, hooked up oxen, and aimed their whole lives toward a dot on the map they'd never seen: the Donner family, the Reed family, the Breen family, the Graves, the Murphys. Good folks, not outlaws, not villains, just people that believed America had something better for 'em out west. And they weren't wrong about the dream. They were wrong about the road, because the West is a liar. It don't tell you the full price up front. It lets you pay in pieces until you've already spent too much to turn around. Now, listen. Every tragedy got a moment where it could have been avoided. One little decision, one turn, let's stay on the main road. And for the Donner Party, that moment had a name: the Hastings Cutoff. There was this man, Lansford Hastings. He wrote a guidebook, bragged about a new route, promised it'd save time, said it'd shave off hundreds of miles. And if you're out there on that trail, dog-tired, sunburnt, sick of dust in your teeth, a shortcut don't sound like a risk. It sounds like mercy. Hastings had folks believing that the main trail was for slow wagons and old men, and that the smart ones took his cutoff. But what he didn't tell them was that his cutoff weren't a road. It was a gamble, and the house was the wilderness. So the Donner Reed Party made the choice. They left the established trail, and the moment they did, it's like the West leaned in and whispered, "Now I got ya." The cutoff led them into country they weren't prepared for. They had to chop trees, clear brush, drag wagons, fix broken axles. spend precious days just trying to move forward. And every day they wasted, the season changed. Fall shifted toward winter, and winter out there ain't like Kentucky winter. Out there, winter is a beast, a big, silent beast that don't need teeth, because it kills you with time. Then came the worst part of the cutoff. The Great Salt Lake Desert, an empty stretch of hell, hot in the day, freezing at night, no water, no shade, just salt and sun and wide open death. Oxen collapsed. Some wagons had to be abandoned. Supplies got left behind, and by the time they crawled out of that desert, they weren't just behind schedule. They were bleeding time, and time, out west, is the one thing you can't buy back. When you're hungry, tired, sunstruck, and scared, your temper gets short, and tempers got real short in that wagon train. By October, stress had poisoned everything. Arguments broke out over who was pulling weight, who was stealing rations, who was slowing everyone down. And then a fight turned into blood. There was a man named John Snyder, a wagon driver. During a heated argument, Snyder started beating a man named Milt Elliott with a whip handle. James Reed stepped in, words escalated, bodies shoved, and Reed pulled a knife. He stabbed Snyder. Snyder bled out in the dust. Now, imagine that scene. You're in the middle of nowhere. No law, no court, no sheriff, just wagons and wind, and a man laying dead at your feet. The wagon train held the kind of trial. Some wanted Reed hanged right there, but they decided on something nearly as deadly. They banished him, just threw him out into the wilderness, and Reed rode off alone toward California, leaving his wife and children behind. That, right there, was the moment everything got cursed. Because once a group breaks apart like that, once trust dies, survival gets harder, and winter was already on the way. By late October of 1846, the wagon train finally reached the edge of the Sierra Nevada. And I want you to picture this now. Back east, mountains are green. Even when it's cold, there's still life. But the Sierra, that range looks like a wall. Not hills, a wall. A jagged line of stone and pine that rises up like the bones of the earth. And that year, the Donners reached it late. Too late. They could feel it. You know how in Kentucky, when the first hard frost hits and the whole world smells different? Like winter just put its hand on your shoulder? Well, out there, it's worse. Out there, the air don't just smell cold, it smells like warning. They'd already lost wagons, lost oxen, lost time, lost unity. But they still believed one thing. If we can just get over the mountains, we're safe. And that's the trap. That thought right there. Because the mountains don't care what you believe. On October 31st, the snow came. Not a cute little first snow. Not a dusting. A storm. A real storm. Wind, thick flakes. The kind of snow that falls sideways like somebody's throwing handfuls of white dirt in your face. They tried to push through anyway, and the wagons started sinking. Oxen chest deep in snow, struggling like they were trapped in molasses. Men were shoveling and pushing, breath coming out in desperate clouds, hands bleeding from cold and work. Then it got worse. The snow piled higher, and the road disappeared. That's the part folks don't think about. When snow gets deep enough, the road is gone. You don't know where safe ground is. You don't know where the ledge drops. You don't know where the trail turns. You're just pushing forward in white blindness. And finally, they had to stop. because at some point, nature makes a decision for you. And the decision that night was simple. Nobody's crossing. The Sierra shut the door, and the Donner Party was trapped on the wrong side of it. They made camp near a lake, a cold, dark lake surrounded by timber. That lake would later be named after them, Donner Lake. They built crude cabins out of logs, pine branches, and desperation. Not the kind of cabins you see on postcards. These were survival boxes. A low roof, tight walls, smoke trapped inside. Snow piling up around them like dirt on a grave. Other members of the party couldn't make it to the lake and camped 6 miles away at a place called Alder Creek. Those folks, especially the Donner families themselves, were in even worse shape. Because at Alder Creek, some of them didn't even have cabins. They had wagons, and those wagons became their shelters. Canvas covers, brush piled up, snow pressed against them. Basically, people living inside a snowbank, and once the storm stacked up, they stopped being camped. They started being buried. The Sierra didn't just trap them, it swallowed them. Snow got so deep that people had to climb out of their shelters through holes like animals. That's what it turned into. Not a camping trip, not a settlement. A nest of starving humans dug into the snow like groundhogs praying for spring. And here's a creepy detail from their diaries. The snow made the world so quiet that you could hear small sounds from far away. A cough in the next cabin, a baby crying, a twig snapping. And that meant one other thing. If something was outside, you'd hear it too. And folks started hearing strange noises. At night, they'd hear the slow crunch of snow like footsteps, wood creaking outside like something leaning on the cabin, occasional scraping sounds. But when they'd open the door, nothing. Just snow blowing into darkness. No animals, no tracks. And that made the fear worse. Because silence don't just feel empty. It feels watchful. Like the wilderness is sitting out there, patient, waiting for you to weaken. At first, they still had beef, the oxen, the cattle. But once the snow trapped them, the animals started dying too. Some froze standing up. Some got slaughtered. They ate everything they could. But there was a problem. Meat alone can't keep you alive long. You need fat, you need flour, you need salt. They had almost none of that. And the longer you go without real food, the body starts turning against itself. People became weak, dizzy, confused. Children cried constantly. Adults started staring off into nothing. And then they began boiling the one thing they still had plenty of: ox hides. Now listen, I'm going to tell you this in the plainest way possible. They were boiling animal skin. They'd cut it into strips, soak it, scrape hair off, then boil it for hours until it turned into a gelatin. A glue-like broth. They called it hide soup. Imagine your whole meal being boiled leather glue. That's when you know you've crossed into survival horror. And still, even that ran low. Dogs disappeared. Not died, disappeared. One diary entry said they ate the dog, Towser. Other dogs vanished completely, and folks wondered, did they run off? Or did hungry humans take them when nobody was looking? Because starvation changes the rules. And once starvation enters the camp, nothing is safe anymore. Not pets, not trust, not even the dead. And you know what else started happening? The bodies that died? They couldn't bury them Ground was frozen. Snow was too deep. So they dragged corpses outside and stacked them in snowbanks, sometimes right beside the cabins, sometimes in the trees, sometimes the bodies became windbreaks. That's right. Human bodies used to block the wind. And after a while, nobody reacted anymore. Death became ordinary. And in that kind of reality, something dark creeps into people's minds. The kind of thought a person normally cannot even form. By mid-December, they realized no rescue was coming unless somebody went for it. So the strongest people left, on homemade snowshoes, across the mountains. They were men, women, and even a child. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. And that name is so perfect it almost don't feel real. Forlorn Hope. Like they already knew they were halfway dead. They walked into the blizzard world. White sky, white ground, frozen wind cutting their faces raw, and as soon as they left, that was it. No turning back. Their footprints filled with snow within minutes. Soon, the storm erased their trail like they never existed. They slept on snow. No tents, no real firewood. Their toes went numb, fingers cracked and bled. Some got snow blindness, eyes burning, swollen, barely able to see. And then, hunger hit them hard. Because you can't walk a mountain pass without fuel. Your body burns calories just trying to stay warm. So what happened was inevitable. The weakest started falling. A man would sit down to rest and then refuse to stand back up. Not because he didn't want to, because his legs were done. And when you lay down in that kind of cold, the sleep comes fast. A warm, peaceful sleep. And that sleep kills you. They tried to carry some. They tried to drag some. But after a point, they had to leave them. Imagine walking away from your friend, 'cause you know stopping means you'll die too. That's what winter does. It don't just kill you. It makes you choose. Then came the point where food was gone completely. Nothing left, not a crumb, not a strip of hide, and now the group was surrounded by bodies. Frozen, dead, preserved by nature, and hunger started whispering. At first, nobody said it out loud, but everybody thought it. Until finally, the unthinkable became the only thing left. They started eating the dead. And here's where it gets especially creepy, because accounts say they wouldn't look at each other while doing it. They'd turn their faces away. Some prayed, some cried. One survivor later said people were weeping as they ate. That detail right there is the most haunting one of all. Not rage, not madness, just humans, broken, doing the worst thing imaginable with tears on their cheeks. And then they did something even darker, something the human mind don't recover from. They drew lots, like some ancient curse, like some old-time sacrifice. They drew lots to decide who would die so others could eat, not because they wanted to, because winter demanded a payment, and somebody had to be the offering. That's why this story still feels haunted to this day, because at that moment, it stopped being a tragedy. It became a ritual, a frozen ritual carried out in the white wilderness, and only a handful made it through. After weeks of hell, a few survivors stumbled into a native village, and those native people fed them, saved them, and carried them toward help. And when the world finally heard what happened, California was horrified, but it was too late for judgment. because up on that mountain, dozens were still trapped, still starving, still waiting. And the worst part? They didn't know if rescue was coming or if winter was just taking its time. When the first survivors of the Forlorn Hope finally stumbled out of the mountains, California didn't know what to believe. They were half dead, barely able to speak, skin pulled tight over bone, feet wrapped in rags, eyes sunken like skulls. And their story sounded impossible. A whole wagon train trapped, dozens starving, families dying in cabins, people eating hide glue just to live another day. And once folks realized it was true, the rescue effort started. Not like a government mission. Not like some organized army thing. It was neighbors, volunteers, men with pack animals, men who knew the trail, and some of them walked into that storm country like they were walking into a war, because they were. Winter out there was an enemy, and the worst part? Even the rescuers didn't fully understand what they were about to see. So when they reached the Donner camps, it hit them all at once, not like a gradual sadness, like a punch. Cabins buried almost to the roof line, smoke stains on snow, frozen lake like black glass, trees standing stiff like dead soldiers. And then faces appeared, not running to greet them, just faces, eyes watching through cracks, people so weak they could barely stand. Some were living in holes dug into snow, not cabins, snow caves, and I want you to picture that now. Human beings living like animal in the frozen ground, waiting to die. One rescuer later described it as if the people weren't even human anymore. Not because they were monsters, but because starvation changes your expression. It empties your eyes. It steals your voice. And the first thing the rescuers heard, over and over, was a question. Weak voices saying, "Are you real?" Because after months trapped in snowstorms, help starts feeling like a dream. And if you've been living in death that long, you stop believing you're meant to be saved. Some folks reportedly cried, some laughed, some just stared. And one woman, legend says, looked up and said, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" Because at that moment, they couldn't tell the difference. Here's a detail the rescuers never forgot. They talked about it for the rest of their lives, but most of them didn't like to speak it out loud. The smell. They said you could smell the camp before you could fully see it. Not just smoke, not just sweat. A smell of sickness, rot, old blood, and something else. Something that only comes when a place becomes a graveyard. Inside the cabins, they found scenes that don't belong in history books. Small children wrapped in blankets, too weak to cry. Men sitting against walls, staring into nothing. Bodies lying where they died, because nobody had the strength to move them. And the truly creepy part? It wasn't always obvious who was dead. Sometimes a rescuer would step into a cabin and see a figure lying motionless. They'd go over to check, only to watch a pair of eyes blink open slowly. Living, but barely. That's the kind of winter horror that don't show up in paintings. When you starve long enough, your body becomes quiet. The line between sleep and death disappears. And out there in the Sierra, it got so bad that the living looked like corpses, and the corpses looked like they were still listening. Rescuers began feeding them. But here's what people don't understand. You can't just give a starving person a feast. If you do, it can kill them. So, the rescuers had to ration food carefully, while knowing every hour wasted meant another child might die. They had to choose who could walk, who could be carried, who had to be left for now, and that word, for now, in a place like that, is terrifying. Now, this is the part of the story that turns it into something almost supernatural, because when rescue finally came, they started counting the dead, and they started noticing something. Some of the bodies people remembered weren't there. Not moved, not buried, gone. And you have to ask yourself, how? This isn't a normal place. Snow was deep, storms constant. The cold preserved corpses like a freezer. And animals? Animals leave tracks. Coyotes, wolves, mountain lions. But in the deep snow around those cabins, there weren't animal tracks like you'd expect. And that led to a grim conclusion. If the dead were missing, and the snow showed no animal paths, then the dead weren't taken by beasts. They were taken by the living. And it wasn't always openly admitted. It wasn't always spoken. But the rescuers knew. The camp knew. Some people had died, and then later, parts of them disappeared. The mountains had turned the camp into a place where even the dead weren't safe, and folks might hear that and go, they were monsters. No, that's not what it was. That was winter stripping away every layer of civilization until the only thing left was, if I don't eat, I will die. And once you've lived with that long enough, your mind stops arguing. It starts obeying. That's why this story still feels like a curse, because it shows what hunger can do. Not to a villain, to a parent, to a neighbor, to a normal person who used to say prayers over supper. Now, listen. This is one of the most heartbreaking chapters. It happened during one of the rescue attempts. When the rescuers started bringing survivors out, the weather shifted again. A sudden blizzard hit the pass, one of the worst of the season, and the rescue party, already exhausted, had survivors with them who were too weak to walk. They were freezing, food was scarce, snow was blinding. And then came the decision that haunts this story. They had to leave some people behind to save the rest. A small group, mostly young women, ended up stranded in a makeshift camp. Later, history called it starved camp. They weren't left because nobody cared. They were left because the rescuers knew if they tried to carry everybody at once, everybody would die. So they promised they'd return. But that promise, in those mountains, was never guaranteed. Some of those girls died waiting, and when rescuers finally made it back, they found bodies curled like sleeping children under snow, frozen in place like statues. That part, right there, hits hard, because it proves something. Rescue doesn't end horror. Sometimes it just rearranges it. Now we need to talk about Tamsin Donner, because if there's one moment in this whole tragedy that feels like a ghost story, it's her. Tamsin was educated, strong-minded, a mother, a wife. Her husband, George Donner, was badly injured and weak. By the time the final rescues came, he was dying. And rescuers told Tamsin, "Come now, or you'll die too." She refused. She wouldn't leave him behind. It wasn't foolishness. It was love. And maybe guilt too, depending on how you see it. But she made her choice. She stayed with George, and the Sierra took her. Later, people argued over what happened next. Some said she died shortly after. Some said her body was never found. Some whispered darker things. But the truth is this: in a camp where people were eating the dead, a missing body becomes a question nobody wants to ask. And Tamsin Donner became a legend for it, because the image is so haunting. A woman sitting in a buried cabin, holding her dying husband's hand, while storms howl outside, knowing there's no rescue left for her, only the mountain. That right there is true winter horror. When the final rescue party arrived, they expected to find nobody, but they found one man alive, Louis Kesselberg. He was alone, and around him were bodies. Frozen bodies, cabins burned, bones left behind, a camp stripped down to death. Kesselberg claimed he survived the best he could, but rumors followed him for the rest of his life. People accused him of hiding food, of taking from the weak, of doing things too dark to repeat in polite company. And whether he deserved every accusation or not, it didn't matter, because history needed somebody to carry the shame. And Kesselberg became the symbol of what winter did to them. He was the last one out, the final shadow stumbling down from the pass, and once he left, the Donner Party was over. But the story never ended. People hear Donner Party and think cannibalism, but that ain't the real horror. The real horror is what that story proves, that humanity is not a permanent state. It's a condition, and it depends on warmth. It depends on safety. It depends on having enough. The Donner Party showed the world something it didn't want to know. If you freeze long enough, if you starve long enough, if you sit in silence long enough, you can become a stranger to yourself, and the mountains will not judge you. The snow will not forgive you. Winter don't care if you're a good man, or a kind mother, or an innocent child. Winter has one law: survive or disappear. And the creepiest detail of all is this: every winter, that pass still closes. Snow still piles up in the same places. Wind still screams through those pines, and travelers still say Donner Pass feels heavy, like a place where the air remembers, like the cold itself has a memory, because some stories don't belong to the past. They belong to the land, and the land don't forget. Now, let me ask you just two questions. If you had been trapped up there, months deep in that white silence, with no road out, no food left, and the storm pounding the roof like it was trying to break in, do you honestly think you could have survived the Donner winter? And if you did, after the hunger, after the cold, after you watched people fade away one by one, do you believe you'd still recognize the person staring back at you when it was finally over? If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's darkest true winter horror, hit like, subscribe to Kentucky Melody, and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the stories the world tried to bury, the ones written in blood, snow, and silence. And remember, never trust a shortcut. Never underestimate winter, because sometimes a storm doesn't just take your life. Sometimes it takes what makes you human.